we're stronger than that. Trouble comes screaming, we always holler back.
But I was asked to give you the latest and greatest and best information. I've tried to do that in a very non-political way if I can. Hopefully that you're just seeing, it's just nuts and bolts. This is a process. It's not perfect, but it is a useful process. So what would you like to know, and we can open it up.
Okay, I thank God that you're on board and that you have been able to have...
Oh, sorry.
Would you, so the camera can hear you.
Okay, anyhow, I'm very thankful that you're there. And I'm thankful that there is a process in place where they're supposedly going to review and evaluate and then come up with our own standards. But as a citizen, I'm so skeptical because the establishment has been pretty gung-ho on Common Core. You've got the chamber, you've got a lot of the educators, and everybody, just basically rubber stamping it and giving it. So my question is, how can we know that these panels, who are going to use your Pew Matrix to reconcile their differences, don't have a preconceived idea? For instance, if it's being chaired by Indo people, how do we know that they're not just going to lead them through the process so that they will want to adopt the Common Core standards? Because, if they have meetings, are those meetings open to the public? Can we come and sit and watch them hash this out? Or, I'm just asking, how do we know it's going to be a legitimate outcome of Hoosiers truly wrestling over the standards and pulling out the best for our children versus a group that's manipulated and led into a pre-desired standard?
Been talking about this issue. Right now, I really do think there'll be some level of public scrutiny of what they're doing, whether they televise it. They've streamed a lot of our work sessions, like for example, our strategic planning work that we're doing right now at the board. They stream all that, and I think there will be some openness somehow, because I know they're talking about that right now. I think that's part of it. Two, I don't know, to be honest with you, I can't tell you if this process is designed in such a way. Remember, it's not perfect. And there's always the potential a person brings their bias to the table. I mean, regardless of...
I'm just saying, how do you keep it from being stacked?
Yeah, I think the way that you do that... Yeah, I think the way that you do that is that you ask some questions, and that's why it's taking so long to get the panels named right now. Everybody's like, who's going to be on the panel? I'm like, well, we'd like to ask some questions of them first. What's your intention? What's your interest? What we're looking for is people who really understand that we don't want lip service. We want a true, genuine evaluation of standards. And the conversations that are taking the longest right now are with the subject matter experts. I don't think that's going to be an issue for them. I think the bigger concern I'm having right now, and I'm expressing an opinion, I'm not trying to talk to the state board, I'll talk as one state board member. I'm concerned about making sure classroom practitioners stay open-minded, and the reason I say that is because when you have a high-stakes accountability system where people's livelihood is now tied to how they perform on a test, the concern, the thing that keeps me up at night is I want to make sure they can be objective in the process and not let fear of what could happen lean them towards thinking like, well, we've been working on these standards and they're kind of like Common Core. I really want them to have it. So the orientation becomes extremely important in this process. I really make sure they understand that. And then the oversight of the board and the department staff in the process, that's why we're having them chair that. So that as they're working with them, we can actually make sure that the process is unfolding the way it's supposed to unfold. The other part of that too is this is why you have a larger committee looking at it so that one person can't run away with the process. That's the advantage of a Pew Matrix, is that it's intended to kind of equalize that to some extent, so one voice doesn't run away with it, because you're averaging that score, that panel's work, and saying, is there 75% of the panel saying on that one standard, and there's many standards, are we in agreement? So you could have one person say, oh, yeah, I love that, and it could be a really bad standard, and the other 9 are actually saying, no, it's not. Even at that, it's not enough, and that's why you have public comment. So there's redundancies in here, and you hope that you have enough redundancies in it that when you're done, to the extent that you can, you've tried to pull out as much of that bias as you can. Because to be honest with you, anybody that says, well, you can eliminate it completely, I got some swampland I want to sell you. Because I don't buy that. I've been teaching this process for 15 years to teachers, and we used to do this very kind of work with textbook adoption. And every time I've ever done it, there'll be one soul, bless their heart, they'll come in and they've already got it figured out, and their job for the rest of the committee work is to convince everybody else that they're right and everybody else is wrong. But this process really does try to equalize that, and there's numerous times to challenge and come back and challenge and re-challenge and refocus. So you hope you have enough of those redundant measures coming back that you can control for some of that, but you never completely can eliminate it. But I think it's a lot better than what we had. So certainly a lot better than an opening question saying, how do you think? What do you feel? Is it okay with you?
Am I to understand that this is something already in process and that when you say we, are you talking about your fellow state board members or are you talking about your staff?
Okay, yeah, thank you so the resolution basically authorizes board staff to lead on it. So the board, the we, is responsible for the resolution. The board has passed it. It is unanimous, including the state superintendent. It is now moved over to board staff. Our board staff is based out of that's what you hear, the CECI staff. Dr. Molly Chamberlain's working. She's working very closely with department staff. And so there's 3 people that are crucial to this process in my mind, maybe 4. Dr. Molly Chamberlain, who's with the board staff, and then Dr. Michelle Walker at the department, Danielle Shockey at the department, and Amy Hort at the department. Those 4, when this is all said and done, I hope at some point the board has somebody go back and acknowledge the work of the department staff and the board staff, because it's easy for me to come and do a presentation. That's the group that's doing the heavy lifting of contacting the subject matter experts. I've had some folks write me, I don't know out of this group, but I've had other groups around the state write and say, well, can we recommend somebody? Sure. You've got to do it really fast, but yes, you can. That gets passed right on to that team, and they're responsible for going through. They'll be ultimately responsible for working with the state superintendent and any recommendation that comes back to the board on the evaluation panels. I do think you will see the board, we as the board, want to weigh in on the evaluation panels. I can't say for certain. I know we've, at least conceptually, at the last meeting, we had a brief update, and I think Superintendent Ritz reported we're on schedule, and I would agree with that. I think she's right. We are on schedule. What that means is that you should see the board talk about panels at the February 5th meeting and probably even discuss a definition about college and career readiness, and that's assuming that we don't see legislation taken on that before then, because I still think the legislature will likely want to weigh in on what they believe is the definition.
And then the comment that this young lady stated in her doubting how somebody could be not for one side or the other. What if, and I know you want to compare the 2 standards, picking the best of the 2 choices, but what if they were not categorized? What if people came in not knowing which was a Common Core standard and the other one, and just did it on, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the reality of it is anybody could walk in with a set of Common Core standards and quickly go, wait a minute, that's not Common Core. I mean, I don't think we're there. I honestly think at this point people understand we now have to evaluate Common Core. That's required. That's the easiest way to prove that we did it. Right. The board has expressed its desire to say we want those previous standards evaluated. That's the easiest way to prove that it was done. Right. And the third column is the easiest way to say there's a reconciliation to say either one or both or none, and this is what we're going with. And we have a living document on how we got to that, because I think when we go to hearings, if I was a constituent, I'd want to know where did these come from? And we need to be able to answer that question. Now, I will tell you, in the interest of full disclosure, what you saw there is not, I'm going to repeat this, is not the graphic organizer. It is something like it. It is a conceptual idea that I was presenting. The department's been working with the board staff on the actual graphic organizers. I think it'll be close to that, but that's just to give you an idea of what they're working on. And thank goodness, because I don't want to create all those, because somebody's working really hard right now to get those ready. There's a lot of them.
My last thing, Ms. Wicker is setting with this topic.
Yeah, that we're on a much better path than what we've ever been on. I don't think, and I don't want to speak for her other than to say, I think the majority of the board, if you listen to any of the public comments right now, everybody that I'm hearing, including legislative leaders or board members, are saying, let's focus on getting Indiana college and career ready standards. We're moving on. Now, that is not to say there's not still some people there that are saying, hey, we have good college and career ready standards in Common Core. That could be possible. But I'm going to let you ask that question directly to Carrie. I think I know how she would answer it. I'm pretty sure it'd be pretty close to how I'd answer it, but I don't want to bias it. So I've had a lot of conversations with her. I think she feels pretty comfortable this is the right track that we're on right now. So.
You understand, Cindy, and the progress that you've made. I have a couple of questions about what you said tonight. Several. The first question is, why were you sued by the state superintendent?
Standards. It had to do with the issuing of preliminary grade data. In a nutshell, to kind of set this in motion for you, last year, I don't know if you're aware, first of all, the grades we were issuing was last year's letter grades. Last year's letter grades, the intent of the accountability system is to provide information to the local community and to the parents primarily to say, this is how your school is performing based on the accountability system. Now, I say that, and I say this to teachers all the time. There's a lot of debate about the accountability system. As I tell people, it is what it is right now. In other words, to the extent that it's designed to calculate a letter grade, that's what it does. There's a lot of debate over what the metrics should be that go into that, and we're working on that with a panel to do that. But we still have a statute that says the board has to issue preliminary letter grades. And if we don't issue those grades, we don't issue the final grades by the end of the year, it impacts the waiver that involves federal dollars flowing to the state. There was and I'll be honest with you, I was one of the ones leading on this. I was arguing as a former central office administrator, we've had the data validated since July. So this stuff that you hear in the paper about, well, they're just trying to rush the grades out. And then you heard, well, there's 55,000 tests that have to be redone. Well, it wasn't 55,000 tests. It was 55,000 open-ended test items. Okay, that's like when we ask an essay question and you write a response and a parent says, that got scored a 3, but I want it rescored because I'm not sure I agree that that's a 3. That was one item out of an entire test. Just to put it in perspective, just so you understand, coming into the month of October, 55,000 test items is not 55,000 tests. It's 1/10 of 1% of all the tests in the state of Indiana. And we're holding up getting letter grades that should have been out that would have let parents know whether you like ADF or not. Some parents wanted those letter grades to say, this is how we're doing. There were some schools that wanted the letter grades. There were superintendents that wanted the letter grades because there's teacher pay raises tied now to those letter grades because teacher effectiveness ratings are tied up in those letter grades. So long story short, we had the big deal about Dr. Bennett potentially cheated and cooked the books, and you remember that whole episode. That's still going on. There was a bipartisan committee, Sheldrick and Grew went and did a study and presented it to the state board. This was at the November 2nd meeting. No. It's at the October 2nd meeting. The October 2nd meeting, they showed up. And here's what they determined. And I think they did a true, genuinely, a non-biased, apolitical evaluation. But here's what they found out. There is separate metrics for elementary and separate metrics for high school in terms of how they compute A to F, simply because you have more metrics to work with at the secondary level. So elementary, basically, the A to F is riding in a large part on basically just I-step testing, to be quite honest with you. Whereas at the high school, you've got things like graduation rates, you've got inter-course assessments, you've got other things in that thing that was cranking out those grades. What they got into is that, and I don't know where the fault lies, but they did not anticipate situations where you have a school that's a K-12 school. And if it's a K-12 school, do you treat it like an elementary school or do you treat it like a secondary school? Well, this Crystal DeHaan that you hear about was a K-10 school. So do you treat it as an elementary school or do you treat it as a secondary school? The mistake that Sheldrick and Grew found out is when those anomalies were discovered, it should have came back to the state board saying, hey, we discovered an anomaly, how do you want to fix it? And the department instead applied their own fix, but what they found is they believed that it was applied equally and fairly, and the way that they proved it is they had, Sheldrick and Grew had DOE run the calculations again. And then they went to Legislative Services Agency. You know what that is, LSA? It's a bipartisan body that sits over in the State House. It's not the legislature, it's a service agency inside of the State House. And they said, here's the computational model, you run the grades. And we're going to take the grades run over here with the DOE, and we're going to take the grades run by the LSA, and guess what we're going to do with them? We're going to compare them. And if they're both the same results, we're going to say basically it was done fairly. And when they did that, they didn't find any disagreement over what they got when they ran them at the department versus what they did at the legislative services. And so what they concluded is they didn't believe there was any kind of cheating per se, in as much as the poor judgment that was exercised was not coming back to the board and saying, Houston, we got a problem, and how do you want to fix it? That being said, when all that happened with the lawsuit, we were trying to get preliminary grades out the door, and we were being told, well, we can't do that, we don't have the data back, we got to get this, and we just kept kicking that can down the road, and we're saying, and I'm going to be honest with you, as a central office administrator, here's the reality. DOE is never going to find, I don't mean this in a mean way, but they're never going to find all the errors. A lot of times you have to embargo the data to the local districts and say, look at your data, and you're going to know right away if it's right or wrong. I'm pretty sure you know your data better than somebody sitting in Indianapolis. And you embargo it, and you give them a chance to work with the department to work through anomalies they're finding with the data so that you can chase it down and get it right. Because once the board issues a preliminary grade, then the appeal period formally opens up in the sense of an actual formal appeal period. So last year, go back 1 year, they were looking at 2012 letter grades They sent that out, embargoed to the districts on September the 19th. Board issued preliminary grades at the end of October. This year, we couldn't even get them out the door. I mean, we finally got them out the door, I want to say like the second or third week in November. And the lawsuit that was generated was basically over the fact that we had a public board meeting in which we discussed, if it's an issue getting the grades out, here's an idea. Since Shelter Greer just had LSA run them, and we know they could run them, why don't we just have both groups run them, and we'll compare them and at least get them out preliminarily, knowing that we may have to go back and refine some grades. But at least let's get moving, because if 99% of the grades are right, why are we holding up the works? And it was chaos. It was, you're rushing them out. At the end of the day, this is what really bothered me. At the end of the day, what we voted on was what we had been talking about in September and October and November, and we ended up doing it the way we were talking about it. We should have just done it. But in that process, what happened was the CEI staff, which is the board staff, watched that and basically said, we think we need to send a letter to legislative leadership saying, hey, listen, we are running out of time, and if you want to see grades go out, you probably ought to consider asking LSA to engage with the Department of Ed in a memorandum of understanding. That triggered that lawsuit. And the question became, and this is kind of how it plays out in my world, when board staff sends me something, or whether the superintendent sends me something, and they say, it's coming to me individually and saying, hey, do you mind putting your signature on that? And I'm looking at it, and it's only coming to me, I'm going to say either yes, put my signature on it, or no. When I'm looking at that, I'm going, we're holding up all the letter grades in the state of Indiana for 1/10 to 1% of all the tests. Yes, I think we need to do something on this. That's what's at the basis of the current suit, whether people agree or disagree. It was a letter. What I learned in that was, from now I'm going to ask the question, say, just for the sake of public scrutiny, why don't we just wait and come back in session and do that, even though we talked about it in the public session, this is not a misunderstanding, because there was. And there are people on both sides of this, it's not political, but there are people on both sides that felt like we should have came in public session, approved the letter. I get it, but that was the basis of the lawsuit. The impact of the lawsuit was worse, because when the lawsuit was filed, it hurt relationships on the board, it brought communication to a grinding halt. And we've got a lot of getting well to do, and frankly, we're getting there now, but it took us on a path that nobody was expecting. And at the end of the day, in my opinion, it had less to do with the Board of Education in as much as a desire to communicate, or at least to say there was an election, the state superintendent has a right to be voiced, and the board does want to work with the state superintendent. I think that needs to be known. But I think it came in the wake of CECI being announced, and I just think all that kind of came to a head in a really strange way, and it's still playing itself out because four private citizens have now picked it up, and it has questions to do about letters, and we'll see how that plays out.
Classroom practitioners who are unbiased, because if it's being implemented, how are you going to find classroom practitioners who are not being influenced by their superiors?
The responsibility we have is to get the standards set right, and I've heard some teachers say, we just want clarity. Are we teaching this? Are we teaching this? What are we teaching? I can't fix everything. I understand. I appreciate the question. I wish I could give you an answer, but anything I gave you would be silly for me to say that, because how do you tell 3,000 schools, 3,000 plus schools, all of a sudden to pivot and go right? I mean, the reality of it is, the best that can happen is let's get the standards affirmed. I have a pretty good suspicion that once the standards are affirmed and we develop an assessment test, and people now know what that assessment test is going to measure, that they're all going to sit up and go, wait a minute, yes, we'll go that way. I think that's how it's going to play out. But you're right. I mean, it is chaos right now in the field, because we did a kind of an implementation phase, and we got teachers saying, do I do Common Core, or do I do the state standards? Do I do this, do that? And we hit pause. But some people didn't pause. I'm going to be honest with you. I've been out in school. Some of them didn't pause. Some just kept flying right on by. And so until we get the standards fixed, get the assessment, until I think you got a problem.
Okay, last
That's
question.
We have multiple questions. Sorry.
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
Okay. I understand that you want it to be college and career readiness. What if you find out that the college and career readiness that we want for Hoosiers is different from college and career readiness, which is outside the state of Indiana? Are you willing to have college and career readiness for our state being different?
I'm not seeing a lot of differences over a definition. I mean, most people accept college readiness as what are the requisite skills and knowledge you need to be able to be successful in college, and career readiness is what are the requisite knowledge and skills you need to be able to go into the workforce. I think the issue, in my mind, has more to do with who has the right to tell a state what standards they'll adopt. I think it has to do with actually doing an evaluation to make sure that our standards are free of bias and somebody hasn't taken their ideology and woven it into the standard in the form of directing a certain pedagogical approach to teaching the standard, I think that's where the differences are going to be. That's my opinion, but I honestly think the definition, while it's a part of it, it's symptomatic. It's not the core problem. The root problem is who owns the standards, who owns the right to determine what our children are supposed to know and do. So I think you have to peel that onion back. The definition's important, but the differences in the definition I don't think are going to be that great. I think the differences are going to be, there's going to be some states that say, you know what, this is going to sound really bad. We're not going to take the time to evaluate this. We'll just accept what they sold us nationally, and if you say they're great standards, okay, they're great standards, we adopted it. You're going to have some states that do that. You're going to have other states like Indiana, and I think Indiana's saying this, that, you know, I'm sorry, but there is no federal right to education expressed. It falls under the 10th Amendment, is a right reserved to the state. It only shows up in the Indiana State Constitution, and Governor Pence is right. He took the constitutional oath. He has a right to say, this is the state of Indiana, and we're going to sign off on our standards. That's where I think that's where this thing's going to play itself out.
Extremely high, specifically in clarity and specificity.
Right.
Would it be shocking that this review coming out would not be consistent with the Fordham Institute's?
To send them out for an external review. I hope we do. I think that will further strengthen and put people at ease that we did what we said we were going to do, and that's one of the things that's in here. Now, whether or not that actually happens, the resolution doesn't call for it expressly to be done. It envisions that is a possibility, that the board wants to expend the resources to do like we did with the old standards and farm them out to Fordham and say, these are our draft standards. You go evaluate them and see if you get a similar result. That's one of the ways we can get back at the questions asked up here earlier about how do you know? That's how you know. Comparative accountability.
State standards. And the result of that could be potentially a hybrid of both, where you have a few Common Core and a few of the old state standards. You vote on them, and that will become the new state standards. The standards you adopt for the Common Core, will the teachers be able to, will those Common Core standards then become Indiana standards where the teachers could teach? Because as the Common Core is now, a lot of teachers complain they can't teach because they don't have the freedom to.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how that might work.
Great question. It's very nuanced but very important. They're not evaluating Common Core against the previous standards. They're evaluating them as a standard set against nationally reconciled statements of what kids should know and do as put out by NCTM and NCTE.
Okay.
So that's one pass.
Sure.
Then they're going to go get the previous standards and they're going to do the same independent evaluation of that.
Okay.
Then they're going to reconcile the two.
Like the hybrid of both?
It could. One of these you're going to see, and I'm just saying this because I've already been looking at the standards. There were some things Common Core addresses that the previous standards didn't.
Right.
There are things that the previous standards address that Common Core doesn't. So when we say a hybrid in the sense that if this column is a plus and this column is a plus and the standards are like the same thing about what a kid will know and do, then it's reasonable that the third indicator that comes out in that third column is going to very much look like a combination of those two. And that's one way that you can get and start to populate a standard. The other possibility is that you get in there and neither one does it at all and they end up drafting something. So how it gets into that third column is really going to be conditioned upon how the evaluation goes on both Common Core, previous standards, and then a reconciliation of the two using that baseline. Does that
They'll
make
become
sense?
Indiana standards.
At the point the board adopts them, they would become Indiana College and Career
We
standards.
have no affiliation with the Common Core.
That's correct.
Or federal.
That's correct, and that's what's got some people kind of concerned because they're saying, well, if you do that, how are you going to know that it's going to be working on national tests? And we're saying, right now, we're worried about our standards. We'll deal with the assessment later. But I do think this is reasonable, and it goes back to the definition question. If you accept the basic premise of college and career readiness standards, other than getting the bias out and getting that pedagogical influence that's put into the standards that you see in Common Core, I think when you're really talking about what is it kids are supposed to know and do, and you get that down to a succinct statement, I really don't think it's going to hurt us in terms of ability to give SAT tests or AP tests, because if they're truly measuring cognitive and affective function of a student, and we're not measuring how well we taught the lattice method, I think we're going to be okay. I really do. And I think and my biggest concern right now is we're going to go through this process and somebody who's not really looked at the standards is going to pick one as an example and go, well, that looks just like it used to. Therefore, they're just paying lip service to it. And that would be a fair statement, because there is an evaluation. Some of these things are going to look the same in the end category. There's no question. I mean, I said this to a group of graduate students on Saturday. There's only so many ways you can express what a student can know and do. And as much as people in here may disagree with me, and you're free to disagree, not everything in Common Core is bad. I mean, some of it is. There's no question. There's clearly some bias expressed in some of that stuff. But there are some statements in there that I don't know how else you would say it. It's been said the best way you can say it. But that's why you do an evaluation. You don't take somebody else's word who says, oh yeah, they're all good, just about them.
Thank you.
Have any, if we put anything called Common Core that's copyrighted, then there's going to be some conflict there, and they're going to try to dictate to it. So how are we going to overcome that?
Yeah, I think in checking into, I think there's some workarounds in that. I mean, there is an extent to which you can claim copyright, but if you're expressing what a child should know and do, there are some ways to get around without saying it verbatim, but getting at the same thing. And so there may have to be some wordsmithing, but that is a concern. The copy, as you mentioned, the Common Core is nationally, I've heard it's nationally copyrighted. I'm saying that, and I haven't really even checked that out for myself, but I've heard the same thing. So that's one legal concern. I think the other legal concern, and this is the proactiveness of legal counsel right now, is making sure that the USDOE understands what we're doing, so that there's credibility to the process, because it's very clear Indiana is pivoting away from where we were in 2010, because in 2010 we were basically telling the feds, oh yeah, we'll adopt Common Core. And now we're saying, we're not adopting Common Core, we're out of the park. So that's happening as we speak, and I can't really comment further on that, because I really honestly don't know what the nature of those conversations are at, other than those are the legal concerns that the council's chasing down. But as I've read what the federal government's published on it in terms of regulatory guidance, I think we're well within our rights. They did envision in the federal guidance that a state could say, we're going to go another route. And I think once they open that up, it's really hard for them to claim that if I say a child will know and do X, that you can exclusively copyright that. Nobody else can know or do that, because how do you do that? I mean, other than if you copied it in its entirety. So I think it's reasonable. There can be some close alignment and close similarity without violating copyright. The legal counsel probably will give you the details. I'm sure they're going to be checking it up and down, because they've been talking about it. Yeah. And whoever decided to let somebody nationalize a copyright standards is... Andrea Neal's going to come talk.
Oliver has anything else you can ask him after the meeting is over with. I think he could probably hang around for a few minutes. Thank you. We should give a round of applause for It's amazing when he made the comment that how much has happened in the past, say 4 months since the 1427 was introduced. But man, when I think about what has happened in a year and a half, which is the very first time that most of the patriot groups ever heard the term Common Core, had no idea what Common Core was all about. And we have got 2 women to thank for that, Heather Crossan and Erin Tuttle.